In our previous episode, Lu Sheng finally formed his own martial avatar. But back on Earth, things were falling apart fast. Even with the combined force of all martial saints couldn't stop AG, just made things more dire. Returning to the real world, he casually floated mid-air, and at this point our boy could no longer continue drawing power because if he did, Earth's natural forces would be completely drained. He confirmed that Lan Chen was right, that Earth could no longer contain his existence. Lifting his gaze toward the stars, our boy remarks that perhaps the universe itself is where he truly belongs. For a second, he wondered if he was strong enough to shatter a planet with a single punch. But he quickly brushed the thought aside, noting that planets aren't eggs, and the deeper you go, the tougher they get. Shaking his head, he admitted he'd gotten a little carried away. After all, he had only just reached the 9th level. As for destroying a star, that's a thought for later. Just then, as his psychic energy spread outward, he heard all sorts of voices. Some were cries of pain, some were rage and despair, and even helpless prayers for salvation. The images hit him like a punch, with broken cities, rubble-strewn streets, and bodies littered everywhere. Children were clutching their mothers who screamed curses at the invading aliens, while the little kids prayed for a superhero to descend from the sky. Shocked, he took a deep breath and pushed his senses further, scanning the entire planet in an instant. Only then did he fully understand the situation. What he saw next made his heart sink. Lin Zhengyue was captured, held in the clutches of a laughing man who mocked the so-called protectors the humans had pinned their hopes on. AG, on the other hand, was having the time of his life. He relished the process of plundering a planet, thriving on the fear etched across every terrified face. To him, these stubborn, fragile creatures were nothing but amusing bugs. If it weren't for a bet he had with his mates, he would have dragged the whole thing out for a month of fun. Suddenly, he declared that for the last time demanding Earth's resources were to be delivered to him immediately. Otherwise, he threatened, he'd wipe out one city every hour until the entire civilization was erased and everyone was dead. With that, he casually tossed Lin Zhengyue aside, remarking that they'd better not keep him waiting. She hit the ground hard, and AG concluded with a sigh, saying even destruction at this point was starting to feel like a dull chore. Lin Zhengyue let out a muffled groan as she hit the ground hard, barely murmuring Lu Sheng's name. Not far away, someone pointed to the sky and asked what that was. Everyone looked up at once and all were shocked, and none of them could believe what they were seeing. AG was confused, questioning why they were all staring at him like that. And why did none of them seem afraid anymore? Then he realized they weren't looking at him, but actually looking above him. Startled, he whipped his head around only to see something falling from the sky. At first, he couldn't make out what it was, thinking maybe a pillar of some sort, but that didn't make sense. But the next second, he gasped, yelling that it was a colossal hand. His mouth wide open in disbelief, and he yelled in denial as his martial avatar was shattered in an instant. Frantically raising both arms to block, he shouted again, refusing to believe this was real, demanding to know who it was. But it didn't matter. His screams were cut short as he was crushed into dust, and AG never figured out who killed him. With that, his entire body simply disintegrated. Everyone below watched in stunned silence. Then joy began to spread. Meanwhile, the wounded marshals, still bleeding and barely standing, remarked in disbelief that the unstoppable alien invader had somehow been killed in an instant. One of them even described it as almost like he was squashed like a mosquito. But even now, no one knew how or what had just happened. Someone whispered that it must have been a god who had descended to save them. Whatever it was, the mood shifted and people erupted into cheers, shouting that the invader was dead. Lin Zhengyue tried to stand, trembling from the pain. As she looked up again, everything still felt surreal. She didn't know who had intervened, but the giant hand began to fade. From within it, she saw someone stepping out. At first, all they could see was a towering three-legged golden crow, but she noticed the person beneath it felt strangely familiar. The next second, she saw our boy's face, and tears welled in her eyes. He landed slowly, gently reaching out and lifting her up, saying she's been through enough, and he knew it. The other surviving martial artists slowly gathered around, and finally realized it was Lu Sheng who killed AG. One of them even asked if he had broken through to the 9th level. Back at home, Lu Sheng's family watched the live broadcast, just as stunned. So were Ling Su, Jiang He, and Ming, who were all unable to believe what they were seeing. Lu Sheng said he had come too late and reasoned that he had only just exited seclusion. Lin Zhengyue bowed respectfully, still reeling from what she'd witnessed. That overwhelming power, the enemy none of them could land a scratch, was killed so effortlessly. The fact that AG didn't even know who killed him was just absurd. And even more absurd, the dude was killed by someone who had just stepped into the 9th level. She couldn't help but wonder just how tall his martial avatar really was. Lu Sheng explained that he hadn't fully released it yet. If he did, the amount of natural energy would rip the planet apart. To test its full scale, he'd need to travel with Lan Chen to a higher-level planet. At that moment, the marshals walked over, shouting that it was their god of the military who had saved them. One of them even remarked they'd truly seen history in the making. For everyone else, the so-called god of the military had always been more myth than reality. But now, seeing the man himself, and so young, left them utterly stunned. Suddenly, someone yelled out the god of the military, and just like that, the crowd roared to life, raising their fists in the air and cheering with everything they had. A few minutes later, our boy learned that Cumberland might still be alive. Lin Zhengyue confirmed it, explaining that they discovered AG hadn't been killing the martial saints outright. Instead, he beat them within an inch of death, then locked them inside a nearby spaceship. The problem was that their attacks couldn't penetrate the ship's defensive barrier. Without a word, Lu Sheng raised his arm like a blade and slashed straight at the hatch. Moments later, a sound like shattering glass rang out, and the next thing they knew, the door was cleaved open. He remarked it was a bit tough, about as hard as cracking a walnut by hand. After sensing that everyone inside was still alive, he left the rest to the others and told Lin Zhengyue he had other matters to handle. With that, he shot skyward. Everyone bowed respectfully, watching him disappear into the sky as the noise of the battlefield faded beneath him. In seconds, he pierced through the atmosphere, already locking on to the general direction of whoever had backed AG. He figured the enemy was likely a 10th level, maybe 11th level, but probably nothing higher. But to him it didn't matter, because the strength he'd gained during the last few days was so overwhelming, even he found it hard to believe. He remarked that even he no longer knew how strong he truly was. Taking a deep breath, he totally forgot the fact there was no air in space. But to him, breathing was just a habit now, not a necessity. He asserted that habits could be broken, and by now he had already transcended the limits of humanity, stepping into a brand new state of existence. He gazed at the endless stars ahead. Here, he could draw even more energy from the universe. Maybe he could finally unleash his martial avatar in full. Moments later, a surge of energy exploded from him. With a roar, his martial avatar grew rapidly, and a massive golden version of himself slowly formed. He turned to glance back, clearly satisfied, and noted this was his first real 9th-level power, and it didn't even matter how strong it was. What mattered was that it looked really cool. After all, what could be more astonishing than a hand the size of a planet crashing down from the sky? He likened it to the palm Buddha used to pin down the Monkey King. At this rate, he felt like the day he could even rival figures like them wasn't far off. As for those space pirates, he remarked they'd better hurry up and show themselves, and they'd better be at least 11th level because anything less would just be boring. He sneered at the thought, comparing it to swatting a mosquito, commenting, "What's the point if there's no challenge?" With that, a new thought crossed his mind. Maybe it was time to sort through his own condition, and of course that universe his teacher had given him. He raised a hand, and a miniature cosmos appeared, spinning slowly in his palm. Meanwhile, on the far side of the galaxy, on another planet, a different scene was unfolding. Crowds of people knelt before a single man. Inside a lavish palace, the fatty lounged over the delicacies. Beside him were piles of energy crystals, and rare resources were stacked beneath his feet. He asked lazily if this was really all they had. A trembling man in a crown replied that this was the full treasure of their royal vault. Desperate, he explained that they could offer no more, and the guide had already been collecting from them for every 10 years. Surely Fatty knew that. Without warning, a hand shot out and seized him by the neck. Fatty lifted him effortlessly, warning him not to lie, declaring that he doesn't really like violence. The man clawed at the air, choking, struggling for breath. Fatty flung him aside like trash and stood up, saying it was time to go. He figured if he stalled any longer, he might end up losing to the other two. Suddenly, he heard a girl cry for her father. Fatty turned his head just in time to see a young girl sprinting toward her injured father. The man, writhing in pain, struggled to raise his voice and called her an idiot, asking why she'd come out and begging her to run. Tears streamed down the girl's face, but before she could do anything, two large hands clamped down on her waist. Fatty appeared behind her, tongue flicking out as he remarked, "How could the man hide such beauty from him?" The girl screamed, and in the next second, she was lifted into the air. Her father, unwilling to give up, stretched out a trembling hand, trying to reach her. But he could only hear her cries fading and Fatty's cruel voice mocking her, telling her to say goodbye to this trash heap of a planet. The last thing she heard was her father roaring in fury, demanding that Fatty give her back. Before long, a spaceship blasted off from the planet. Inside, we see some frantically really large chests, and the girl was tied up and hanged mid-air, but Fatty had already lost interest in her. Instead, he was busy video calling his mate, casually asking how things were going. The other man responded that everything had gone smoothly, and he was also preparing to return. However, he suggested they make a detour to check in on AG. Fatty, puzzled, asked what was up. The guy replied he wasn't sure what had happened, but AG's life signal had suddenly gone dark, even though his ship hadn't moved. Meanwhile, the scene then returns to Lu Sheng once again. He had entered that miniature universe and finally realized the dream realm he had once explored was actually the interior of this very universe. The scenery was almost identical except for base 1359, now completely gone, and he noted the planet that once held it was nothing but empty space now. He reflected that everything had been shattered by his teacher, broken down and refined into nutrients to be absorbed into his own martial path. But he stated that not all was lost because the fire seed resource still existed within this place, and in fact, it was even stronger than before. Without the need to simulate based on a fake environment, it could now fully focus on its core functions, which included deducing techniques, predicting the future, and locating resources. He realized this was the true power behind the Dream Realm's fire seed resource. He had always wondered how it gathered and processed such massive amounts of data, but now he knew. By now, he had fully inherited the original power of that entire planet. It was just a speck in the grand scale of this universe, but he understood that when the time came to challenge the 16th level and beyond, and when he set out to save the universe itself, he would need to refine the entire origin force. He remarked that it's all powered by the universal origin force. The flaws in previous simulations were simply the result of how little of that force he could access. Fueled with newfound purpose, our boy couldn't contain his excitement, and he couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. From the time when he had to fight grandmasters from every single street, then clearing out the entire base, to now preparing to conquer entire planets. But these planets were just one of many worlds scattered across an entire universe. And for his perfect martial path to reach perfection, he needed more training. He reflected that just one planet's power had already boosted him to such terrifying heights. He couldn't begin to imagine when he conquered the entire universe. Thinking about the future, he remarked maybe, just maybe, by that point, he wouldn't just follow the path of martial arts. By that point, he'd become the very meaning of it.